When people hear the name Rhodesia, they usually think of the turbulent history of colonial Africa. But hidden within that story is a small community that once played an outsized role. The White Rhodesians. Who are they? What were their roots? And what does their DNA reveal about their ancestry and phenotypes? Today, we'll break down the history, genetics, and legacy of this community, a population that once numbered over 200,000 but has now largely disappeared from Zimbabwe. White settlement in southern Rhodesia began in the late 19th century after Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company pushed northward from South Africa. The settlers were not a random mix of Europeans. The majority came from very specific backgrounds. British Isles. The overwhelming majority were English, Scottish, and Irish families who migrated from Britain directly or from South Africa. Afrikaners. A smaller but significant number were Afrikaners of Dutch, German, and French Huguenot descent who crossed over from South Africa. Portuguese. Some settlers came from neighboring Mozambique. Greeks, Italians, and other southern Europeans. Small merchant communities also established themselves in Rhodesian cities. By the 1960s, the white population of Rhodesia had peaked at around 220,000 people, making up roughly 5% of the total population. Rhodesia's immigration policy played a key role in shaping who became part of the white community. The government actively promoted settlement, but only from specific groups. British priority. Settlers from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were given preference, reinforcing Rhodesia's British identity. Afrikaner settlers. Afrikaners from South Africa were encouraged, but in balance with British arrivals to avoid shifting the culture. Southern Europeans, Portuguese, Italians, and Greeks were admitted in smaller numbers, especially in towns and farming communities. However, policymakers still stressed preserving a British character. Exclusion. Non-Europeans, and even those of mixed ancestry, were excluded from white immigration. This selective policy ensured that white Rhodesians remained overwhelmingly European in DNA, with little to no admixture compared to other settler societies. It also explains why their phenotypes closely reflected their European origins. Unlike many populations in Latin America or the Caribbean, white Rhodesians did not experience large-scale genetic mixing with Africans. Their DNA is essentially European, with ancestry closely tied to British Isles genetics, the dominant element. South African Afrikaner genetics. Dutch, German, French. Minor influences from Southern Europe. Portuguese, Italian, Greek. In other words, a white Rhodesian's DNA profile would look nearly identical to a British person's, with some overlap to Afrikaners and other European colonists in southern Africa. Studies of white South Africans show virtually no sub-Saharan admixture, and this applies equally to Rhodesians, since they were part of the same colonial migrations. So what did white Rhodesians look like? British-descended Rhodesians. Light to fair skin, straight or wavy brown or blonde hair, blue, green, or hazel eyes. Strong resemblance to English or Scottish phenotypes. Afrikaner-descended Rhodesians, often fair-skinned, with a slightly higher frequency of blonde hair and blue eyes, sometimes more robust, stocky builds, features consistent with Dutch and German ancestry. Southern European Rhodesians, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, olive-tone complexions, darker hair and eyes, more Mediterranean features, though this group was always a minority. What made white Rhodesians distinct was not unique genetics but the context. European settlers transplanted into the African landscape. This contrast, European phenotypes living in a tropical African setting, gave them a unique cultural and visual identity. Culturally, white Rhodesians saw themselves as both European and African. They were deeply tied to Britain, but many were born and raised in Africa, developing a frontier identity similar to Afrikaners. They mostly lived in cities like Salisbury, now Harare, and Bulawayo, as well as farming settlements across the Fertile Highlands. White Rhodesians held political and economic power during the colonial period, which led to tensions with the African majority and the rise of independence movements. After the Unilateral Declaration of Independence (UDI) in 1965, Rhodesia became internationally isolated. By 1980, after years of conflict, Rhodesia transitioned into Zimbabwe under majority rule. For white Rhodesians, this was a turning point. Many emigrated. South Africa took in large numbers. The United Kingdom received tens of thousands. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada became home to others. By the early 2000s, Zimbabwe's land reform programs pushed out most of the remaining white farmers. Today, the white population of Zimbabwe is estimated at only 30,000 to 40,000 people, a fraction of what it once was. The descendants of white Rhodesians now live mostly in the UK, South Africa, and the English-speaking world. Their phenotypes remain European, but their cultural identity is more complex. Some see themselves as Africans in exile, while others identify more with their ancestral homelands in Europe. The story of white Rhodesians is not one of genetic mixing or unique DNA. Instead, it is a story of European settlers, mostly British, who built a society in Africa. Their DNA tells us they were British and European at their core. Their phenotypes reflected the landscapes of Europe, not Africa, but their history, their identity, and their culture were forged in the African soil of Rhodesia. Today, the community has largely vanished from Zimbabwe, but their descendants live on across the globe, carrying with them the memory of a society that no longer exists. See you next time.